international conference online hosted by Ateneo de Manila University in collaboration with SHAM Centro de Humanidades, Universidad de Nueva de Lisboa, and the National Quincentennial Committee of the Republic of the Philippines. It's now 3 p.m. local time. Good afternoon from Manila. We are live streaming on the conference YouTube channel and the National Quincentennial Committee Facebook page. Good afternoon to everyone in this Zoom room and social media. The Department of Interdisciplinary Studies is happy to host today's event, the opening of Legacies of the Encounter in Institutions, Part 3 of Contacts and Continuities 500 Years of Asian Iberian Encounters, a month-long conference series in 4 parts. From today until Tuesday next week, there will be panels on themes relating to institutions, political, economic, religious, and social. Speakers explore the ways in which social structures have been transformed by Asian European encounters by looking at the evolution of forms of government, laws, education systems, as well as religious and other social institutions. I am Jean Tan, and I will be joined by Nikki Carci Cruz later in the program. We will be your co-moderators for this afternoon's events. Nikki and I are from the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies from the School of Humanities of Ateneo de Manila. What do we have in store for you this afternoon? Let me give you a run-through of our program. We will have 2 back-to-back events this afternoon. The first hour from 3 to 4 p.m. will be devoted to the opening keynote with its own Q&A. This will be followed by panel 10 entitled Negotiations of Institutions from the Middle Ages Onward. For the next 2.5 hours, we will have presentations from our keynote speaker and 3 panel speakers. For the Q&A, we will entertain questions from 3 audiences, here in the Zoom room, from the YouTube comment section, and from Facebook. Our community managers will monitor those channels and relay the questions to us. I invite our viewers to please type your questions and we will gather them and read them out for you later. Let me now introduce our keynote speaker. Today's keynote speech is entitled The Poetics of Praise and the Demands of Confession in Early Spanish Philippines, to be delivered by Professor Vicente Rafael from the University of Washington. Vicente L. Rafael is the author of several works on the historical and cultural politics of the colonial and post-colonial Philippines, including Contracting Colonialism, Translation and Christian Conversion in Tagalog Society under Early Spanish Rule. It was first published in 1992. It won the National Book Award and has since seen 8 printings. He's also the author of Motherless Tongues, The Insurgency of Language Amid Wars of Translation, 2016, The Promise of the Foreign, Nationalism and the Techniques of Translation in the Spanish Philippines, 2005, and White Love and Other Events in Filipino History, 2000. He is the editor of Discrepant Histories, Translocal Essays in Filipino Cultures, 1995, Figures of Criminality in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Colonial Vietnam, 1999, and Nick Joaquin's collection of short stories, The Woman Who Had 2 Navels and the Tales of the Tropical Gothic, 2017. Currently, he is finishing a manuscript on politics and the aesthetics of the Duterte regime. The title of the book is The Sovereign Trickster, Death and Laughter in the Age of Duterte, to be published by Duke and the Ateneo de Manila. Let us all give a warm virtual round of applause for Dr. Vince Rafael. Vince, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to have a chance to address people back home, especially in my old alma mater, the Ateneo, who has always been very hospitable to a lot of stuff that I am working on. Very grateful to Nikki, who helped organize this, to Jean, of course, who introduced me, and to Noel Rodriguez, who first asked me to be a keynote. And let me just say hello to a lot of other people I see who are on this Zoom conference, and hope we can have an interesting Q&A afterwards. For my keynote today, I thought I'd return to the scene of the crime, as it were, and revisit some of the themes that I had examined in my earlier work on colonization and Christian conversion among the Tagalogs between the late 16th and the mid 18th century. However, I want to reframe my analysis in relation not just to the politics of translation, as I had in the past, but also within the context of what I've been thinking of as a spiritual politics as articulated in the practices of magic and in the practices of discipline. I do so in relationship to two kinds of writing from this period. The first set of writings I want to look at is a series of Dalits, a kind of devotional poetry praising the works of missionaries written by Tagalog natives. And the second set of documents, or document in this case, which is an excerpt from a bilingual confessional manual by a Franciscan friar, typical of guides used by Spanish priests to aid them in hearing the confessions of native converts. Both sets of documents were published during the early part of the Spanish colonial period, between the later 16th to the middle of the 18th century. In trying to understand these texts, we might begin by asking, what is the relationship between the discourses of praise and the practice of confession? In the vernacular devotional poems, one comes across, or one is struck by the fact that there is a sort of recurring poetics of praise that is directed at the book itself, referred to by the Spanish word libro, or by the vernacular term sulat, inscriptions or writings, which of course is a word derived from Sanskrit by the Tagalog poets. The book comes across as the object of esteem, radiating a kind of magical power. And it's this incredible attachment to the book that I want to really focus on. For this reason, the book was a source of great fascination and attachment for native converts. This intense fascination may have had to do with the novelty of the book as such. The very first book published in the Philippines, after all, was Doctrina Christiana in 1593, a catechism that contained a confessional manual. In the printed books introduced by the Spanish missionaries, Latin letters replaced the native Baybayin script, derived from Sanskrit, like most indigenous Southeast Asian writing systems, whereas the Baybayin was widely understood by native populations prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. The Libro came across as a series of undecipherable signs during the onset of colonial rule. Laden with mysterious inscriptions, the Libro was the repository of a new language, vernacular speech based with novel terms for God, Virgin, Holy Spirit, etc., left untranslated in Castilian and Latin by the Spaniards for fear that natives would conflate them with the terms for local beliefs. Instead, Spanish writing in the vernaculars referenced novel figures with no immediate equivalents in the local spirit world. Small wonder that in the poems, the Libro seems invested with magical powers, like amulets, fetish objects that were widely known in native society for their protective effects. The book's magical potency was in direct relationship to its dense opacity. As with local amulets, the book's uncanny obscurity suggested the workings of layers of potency that could be activated with a proper performance of rituals. It thus promised a means of protecting one from the penetration of malevolent spirits. Such potency was further underwritten by the book's provenance from a powerful because distant and foreign source. Let's look at some of the examples, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, taken largely from Bienvenido Lumbrera's classic book on the history of Tagalog poetry. For example, and can we have the first slide, please? Well,
yeah, the slide is showing. So I think, Vince, you have to use side-by-side view as your option.
Okay. Okay. Let's see.
You have view option.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So here's an example. One of the earliest Tagalog Dalits from 1605. And I, rather than read the original, I thought I'd just read my translation of the original. And as I said, these are from Bien Lambert's book, and so you can look for the original in his book. This one is by an anonymous poet. Though it be stormy and dark, the tearful plains notwithstanding, I'll struggle on, I will voyage on, and persistent searching for God our Father. I may not sleep at all, this temptation bearing down on me. I will continue to dare. This book I will read and find here the weapon that I need. Next slide, please. This is from Pedro Suarez Osorio's Dalit, Salamat ng Walang Hoya. O good and holy book, all that you contain could never be equaled by all the wealth in the world. O book that fills one with delight, a boat so strong to take us all home to the blissful land. Next slide, please. You are our lodestar, that which is our guide until we all reach the peaceful harbor. You are the great mine where we can dig for wealth, for true wealth and life everlasting. Next slide, please. And this one is from Francisco Bagong Banta, who was a Ladino poet from 1605. O book most holy, o libro preciosa pieza, you enfold in your pages, tú en ti contienes y encierras all of the good teachings, cualquiera doctrina buena, that penetrate the soul, que dentro el alma penetra. Next slide, please. You are the sturdy weapon, tú eres alma fuerte y cierta, which I will use in the battle, de que usaré yo en la guerra, when I am tempted by the devil, cuando el mal diablo me tienta. You are the firm staff, bordón de strana firmeza, and you give me great skills, y dará gran ligereza. In my journey on this earth, mientras ando en esta tierra, until I behold God himself, hasta que al mismo Dios vea. Next slide, please. You are the unbreakable rudder, eres timón que no quiebra, even if tempest rages, aunque haya tempestad recia. In you I trust completely, mi esperanza en ti está puesta, to bring me to a safe place, en aquesta mi carrera. So, and then we can go back to me for a while. Yeah. Let me just make a few commentaries on these passages, which are all very similar, as you can see in the devotional poems. The book itself, the object of attachment, is thus treated as a thing, and its thing was to provide the things for keeping safe its holders. Like a sturdy staff or a strong boat, the libro was a lodestar and a weapon. It was spoken of as a storehouse of rich resources, jewelry and silk, for example, with which to hone the skills of its holders and guide them on their journeys. Along the same vein, the book had an apotropic function. It was meant to fend off evil spirits, including the devil, and shield one from catastrophic events such as illness and death, unknown forces, and so on. In short, the libro, as a magical object, was meant to keep one from being carried away, from being possessed, occupied, perhaps we can even say colonized by alien spirits. However, the book as object was one thing, but its content was another matter. The book usually contained a set of sermons or a catechism that more often than not was appended with a confessional manual. Confessional manuals in Spanish and vernacular languages moved in the opposite direction of the devotional laudatory poetry. Such manuals were codified in Europe around the 13th century after the Fourth Lateran Council. Confession is the sacrament meant to continue and consolidate baptism, where the latter initiated one into the Christian faith, the former grew out of an acknowledgement of the inherent sinfulness of the human being, requiring the need for continuous penance. Confession was thus crucial to sustaining conversion, which was not merely a matter of denouncing the devil and affirming the faith. It was also a continuous process of accounting, in the double sense of that word, for one's sinfulness and submitting to the mercy of God via the clergy. Confession thereby linked obligation with obedience by way of regulating conduct down to the most intimate levels of thinking and behavior. We see this in the list of questions and demands indexed to the 6th and 7th commandment in the confessional manual, which I will shortly talk about. This regulation of conduct required submitting to the guidance of the priest, who in turn drew his authority from a chain of submissions he performed to higher authorities, all the way up to God the Father. With confession, we get an instantiation of what Michel Foucault calls pastoral power, characteristic of the Christian church and other Abrahamic faiths. Just as the shepherd took care of the flock by caring for each and every sheep, so the priest sought to care for the entire population of converts by attending to each and every individual member. The practice of confession crystallized this mode of pastoral governance with great clarity. By the latter Middle Ages, the rules for confessing had become highly codified. It was to be auricular, individual, and regularly practiced throughout the year. Such rules were meant to produce a power relationship between priest and penitent that was as intimate as it was hierarchical. Its tactics, as detailed in the confessional manuals, are well known. They entailed constant surveillance via the examination of conscience, narrative exposition via the accounting for one's sins to another who then dispenses penance, economic expenditure, the exchange of a narrative of sin for a formula of repentance, and redemptive expectation, the promise of salvation in the hereafter, and with it, the very end of the demand for and of confession. As a protocol for governing both colonizer and colonized, confession was also a means for forging a sense of self that was steeped in sin. This sinful state was the condition of possibility from which the convert could gain knowledge of itself through the examination of conscience necessary for making a good confession. Through the work of sustained self-interrogation, the convert recalled its past into a narrative of offenses against God. Assuming guilt, the well-examined conscience could now turn to the priest and reiterate its complete dependence on God for its redemption. We can thus think of confession as integral to the logic and logistics of colonial rule. Simply put, confessional practice encapsulated the whole range of discursive and ritual elements for enforcing and materializing colonial power as a mode of pastoral governance. We can then return to the question we started out with. What is the relationship between the poetry of praise and the confessional manuals? Unlike the Dalit or devotional poems that praised the book while invoking its protection, bilingual confessional manuals were meant to have disciplinary effects. They targeted the population as a whole precisely by targeting each and every member of it. Confession was the revelation of one's sins in response to the revelation of the mystery of the Passion. Rather than protect one from the invasion of outside alien forces, as in the case of the Dalit, confession interpolated both convert and priest into a discourse of guilt. Guilt emerges through the assumption of individual responsibility for its sins. To become responsible in this case is to respond to the questioning of the confessor. The questions in the confessional manuals were structured by way of the Ten Commandments. God's law determined the content and style of the priest's questioning and the penitent's response. Each commandment furnished a guide with which to examine the nature and number of transgressions of the penitent. What was important then was not just the quality of one's sins, but their quantity as well. not just the variety of acts, but the intensity of desire that accompany them, not just their occurrence, but the frequency of their recurrence, not just what one did and not just what one thought while doing it, but how many times one did it and thought such things. To see this interplay of quality and to see this interplay of the quantity and quality of sinfulness, let's take a look at the section on the sixth commandment in Fray Sebastián de Totanes Manual Tagalog from 1745. And here, can we have the next slide? And these are the kinds of questions that someone confessing would have expected to hear when you got to the sixth commandment. Did you sin against the sixth commandment of the Lord since your last good confession? Did you sin with some other woman? How many did you sin with? Were they married or not? Go slowly with each one. You have to tell carefully every single sin you committed against God, according to what I think, according to what I will ask you in order, in the order of your sins, etc. The first woman you sinned with since your last confession, is she married? Is she a relative? How are you related? Are you first cousins, etc.? Next slide, please. How many times did you sin with her? You say that you always see each other by yourselves. How would I know how many times those were? If you cannot tell me the exact number, tell me more or less according to your best guess. If you cannot tell me as much, tell me how many years or months or weeks or days since you first started sinning with her. And throughout this time, how many times did you sin with her each week? Was it every day, every other day, or what? And other than being together on other days and hours, did you not joke around and play around in a wanton manner or maralas? And in your playing, did you not also speak lasciviously and at other times embrace each other and kiss each other and touch each other all over your bodies without reserve? And did something dirty come out, nilabasan, of your body? And did you also cause her to emit something dirty? Next slide, please. Other than this, did you also play and fool around with other women, or did you fool around with other men, your fellow males or females? And in your fooling around, did you say lewd things to one another? Was it just with words that you were playing around, or did you also fool around with your hands? And how did you do this? Did you poke and touch each other? And did you show each other's bodies? And did you emit something dirty? And did you cause the other to emit something dirty? Next slide, please. How many of you were fooling around this way? And how many of you had spouses? And how many of you were single? And were there others watching you? And how many times did you fool around in that manner with another man like you or another woman? Did you commit some particular offense? And what was that? Did you sleep together? Did you lie on top of each other? What did you do? Do not be ashamed to say it, since you had no shame doing it in front of God, who saw you and who was here in front of you and who was watching your confession. And did you do anything lewd to some other animal? And what was that? And how many times? And was that in front of others? How many? Etc. Okay, so you can come back to me now. Okay, thank you. So again, let me make a comment on this. In the discourse of confession, you can see how guilt is meant to produce self-knowledge through the examination of conscience. It entails the performance of a certain intimacy, an opening up, a surrendering to the relentless probing, hence the emphasis on quantity, how many times, how often, etc. Surrendering to the relentless probing, poking, and penetration of the priest, who himself is a product of the same ongoing process of submission. Hence, the confession introduced a new kind of subjectivity in Native society. It was the subject whose speech is about him or herself, but only to the extent that that speech itself had been highly regulated, codified, and temporalized. The convert was thus a subject who participated in its own governing and colonization by way of ferreting out and subjugating its sinful self, delivering it up for judgment to the confessor, submitting itself as a recipient of God's mercy. We can see from this brief discussion a central and ongoing tension within the project of colonial conversion. On the one hand, native poets seized upon the poetics of devotion to protect themselves. They treated the book as if it were a storehouse of amulets. On the other hand, confessional manuals were meant to establish colonial power relationships based on discipline and self-disclosure. It was meant to govern the convert at his or her most intimate and interior places, encouraging him or her to expose himself or herself to the relentless inquisition of the confessor. One sees traces of this tension in various missionary accounts. For example, priests complained about the putative perversion of native confession. They would complain, for example, about the natives' tendency to proclaim their innocence and instead blurt out the purported sins, but of their neighbors and friends, not their sins, but the sins of their neighbors and friends. Similarly, priests lamented the evasion and indirectness of native speech so that their confessions were less a straightforward accounting of their sins and seemed more like the telling of riddles or buktong that confounded and confused the priest about the nature of their transgressions. In other words, from the perspective of the missionaries, there was no shortage of tactics on the part of natives for escaping confession's demands for enforced intimacy. Seen from a broader perspective, the juxtaposition of these two kinds of colonial texts show the workings of what Foucault elsewhere has referred to as spiritual politics. On the one hand, colonial rule was and is the attempt to convert the conduct of its subjects. On the other hand, we see how every attempt at conducting native conduct gave rise to attempts at counter-conduct on the part of the converts. Such counter-conducts are arguably nascent forms of resistance, but they can also be understood as tacit forms of capitulation. The practice of native confession, therefore, had ambivalent effects. It undermined as much as it propped up the demands of colonial authority. Why should this be the case? Again, we need to return to the question of poetry and how the poetic is in some ways continuous with the magical. One of the stakes in the fetishization of the book or libro is the struggle over new forms of magical power. Spiritual politics here is manifest in the attempts to imagine the book as a magical instrument, an arte or techne with which to shape both the world and the self. By magic, I mean not superstition, but a set of practices with which to come to terms with the accidental, the unexpected, and the uncanny. The most uncanny and accidental event from the perspective of native peoples were the Spanish invasion and occupation of the archipelago. As I've argued elsewhere, Christian conversion on the part of the natives was one of the attempts with which to come to terms with the shock occasioned by the colonial Christian uncanny. Conversion allowed the convert to tap into the magical potency of the book. As extolled in the Dalit, the very means for governing native souls were seized upon by native poets to imagine new ways of protecting themselves and their fellow natives from the trauma of conquest. And since the Spanish friar monopolized access to the book, its mysterious languages, and its promise of protection, he himself was invested with a certain power. What is this power that native converts invested in the friar? It is no less and no more than the power of mediation. The friar's power lay in his ability to serve as a conduit and as a translator. He was therefore a medium for the circulation of what was, from the native perspective, a magical language that could reach other worlds and other beings. Put differently, the friar drew his power from being the media for mediation itself. For natives, to confess was to submit to the demands of the friar and thereby establish a certain proximity and access to this power of mediation. Confession afforded a kind of tactical intimacy that allowed the native to appropriate, or better yet, expropriate the very native language now infused with foreign words and foreign notions with which his obedience was being hailed. By confessing, the native gave in, but did not necessarily give up. The obligation to confess arguably deferred rather than merely led to the unqualified obedience among native converts. All of which is to say that an examination of the tensions and seeming contradictions between the devotion to the book on one hand and the enforced intimacy of confession on the other indicates some of the ways in which spiritual politics were at work. As with all politics, it is always doubled and contradictory. It can bring with it the emancipatory promise of another self by presenting possibilities of an other redeemed world. But that other world and that other self also came at a steep price: the absolutism of colonial rule and the ongoing terrors of its violent demands. Thank you.
Oh, wow.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rafael.
You know, I have to say, Noel told me to turn off my camera because my facial expressions were giving away my response to some of those things. to, to the voyeuristic kind of questioning this. Wow, what a keynote. Okay, so we'll invite people in the Zoom room. If you have questions, please feel free to raise your hands. If you have immediate reactions, please feel free to raise your hands or type in the chat box. No? We do have a few comments from YouTube, but let me ask first, is there anybody in the Zoom room with an initial reaction who wants to please raise your hand? Okay. If not, oh no, Father Tony de Castro raised his hand. So Father Tony, please, can we unmute you? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vince, for that talk.
Can I see your video? It'd be nice to see people's video.
Yeah. My problem is that my bandwidth is rather unstable. My connection here from Zamboanga, it comes and goes, and there were parts, in fact, of your talk that I was not able to catch wholly. Okay, but first, I think what I, having read your works, and I think the new thing here is this kind of juxtaposition of these two texts. I don't know whether you've really done that before, but what I'd like to ask about is, would you say that this confessional practice is different as applied to natives, the new converts, or to the Spaniards themselves? It seems to me that these confessionarios, having come from the Franciscans, and the other religious orders, have drawn from their own practices, you might say, as monastic or conventual communities. So, for example, the questions about male, about that Nikki, I guess, was really startled. Well, although I have to assure Nikki that these confessional practices, we don't have them anymore. We don't do that anymore.
Well, not according to Duterte. Not according to Duterte.
Well, because he has a dirty mind, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So in any case, just to assure her that this is not the way we do it post-Vatican II, etc. But in any case, I think my question has to do, is there a qualitative difference then in the application of this, assuming that in fact these questions are asked, right, in the confessional? Would you say that there's a different practice that is coming from the friars, or are we more concerned about the effects, as it were, on different sets of people?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know if this is a purely monastic practice. If the Jesuits, for example, did the same thing, to tell you the truth, I've not seen a Jesuit confessionario. Although my guess is they probably adopted it too, features of it too, because you can imagine a lot of the missionaries coming and not being well versed in the vernacular, and so they needed a cheat sheet, as it were, a guide. And of course it was very convenient because it was structured around the 10 commandments. So all you had to do was go through each of the 10 commandments to figure out, okay, did you sin against this? Did you sin against, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the matter of counting was very important, of course, because the idea was to have a complete tabulation, a complete accounting of your sins, and that if you missed one instance, that then went into the sins that you had to confess again in the future, right? So quantity and quality were very important. But you can see the effect of this was to intensify the scene of confession, to make it almost like a pornographic machinery for imagining all the possible sort of things that you could have done to your body, to other people's bodies, and so forth. And and as I said, it was a way of probing into the most intimate practices, and therefore consistent with the whole sort of trajectory. The whole pastoral governance of Christianity, which is to be able to, as Foucault says, to conduct the conduct of people on the most microscopic level, right? From the most macroscopic to the most microscopic level. And confession was just a terrific way of doing that. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I received a private message from Stuart McManus, but is it okay, Stuart, if you ask this yourself? Would it be okay? Can you unmute yourself? Stuart? Okay, if not, I'll just read it. How did the reaction to books in the Philippines differ from provincial areas of Europe where books were less common? Also, what about Chinese book culture that was presumably also present in the archipelago?
I don't know. I mean, it's, I always assume that the idea of the book as an object of attachment, as an object of affection, or as a source of terror. I mean, this is not uncommon in many places and other times, even today. People like to post pictures of their books on Facebook. Doesn't mean they've read it. It's simply a way of advertising that, look at all my books. And look what it says about me, and who I keep as company, and so forth. There's how it is in China. Where of course book learning was a big deal. I'm not really sure. Was there much of that in the Philippines in the 16th, 17th century? I don't think so. I think the idea of the libro was quite a novel object, which further explains the novelty of the book, combined with its opacity. That is to say, the fact that it represented some mysterious, erratic presence that only very few people had access to. I think that intensified its sense of how shall I say, the fact that it was a kind of magical object, that people could have access to. I mean, just ask any graduate student today how they feel about their books. It's this magical object, right? That will provide them with promise, but at the same time could possibly turn back and curse them as well. So I mean, that's this whole thing about book culture is interesting in that way, right? So yeah, that's what I would have to. Go ahead.
I was wondering if May Horelia, who is here, would want to weigh in. would you want to
Oh yeah,
join?
May. Hi, May.
Hang on.
Yeah, we'd have to unmute you. Yeah, here.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Hi, hey Vince, good to see you.
Hey, good to see you too. Good to see you're back.
I am back. Sorry, I wasn't prepared to talk, so I cannot.
Yeah.
I cannot reveal what I look like because I'm shifting
Yeah.
between. But anyway, lovely talk about books, and I just want to add, to the Facebook post that in the Zoom era, the bookcase has become a status symbol almost, and a part of your identification. So it's taken on so many meanings. But the question was on, sorry, the effect. I forgot the question on the effect of the books.
Yeah.
Nikki, what was it? Sorry.
It's how did the reaction to books in the Philippines differ from the provincial areas of Europe where books were less common? Also, what about Chinese book culture that was presumably also present in the archipelago?
I don't want to answer. I don't want to take the spotlight from Vince, but very briefly, 17th. I'm talking about 17th century or 18th century.
17th and 18th. Yeah.
Okay. Much like provincial Europe, there was very little effect of for the masses of what the book was, because it was a very exclusive object. It was an expensive object. It was not mass produced. And certainly there were no bookshops in the provinces, say, that you can hop onto and buy a copy. So as for Chinese books, I think they were made mainly for missionaries who were going to China, because China was the ultimate goal for conversion and martyrdom. So very limited market also here. I'm talking about self-promotion. I'm talking about the survival of Philippine early imprints, and I don't know if I'll take on these issues, but I can for my presentation next week. So there. I don't know. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much for chiming in. Vince, I do have a question. What made people respond to this? Well, how did you get people to go to confession and to follow its rules? What was in operation that made people willing to do that?
Yeah, well, I think this has to do with the sort of the sense that conversion entailed obedience, right? One of the things, there was an obligation to obey, and of course the locus of obedience was the friar, the missionary, right? And missionary basically was there to reorganize, radically reorganize the lives and the conduct of the converts, and part of that reorganization was this demand for confession. You have to confess and so forth. The interesting thing about sort of thinking about confession during this early period is precisely how did they get people to come and do this confession? Because confession in this case, was very peculiar. So when you think about it, even today, it's a very peculiar ritual, because you can't do it collectively. It's not like group therapy. Where you go in a room and you sit around and you talk about all your failings and so forth. In other words, it's nothing about confession that's therapeutic, right? In the case of confession, it really is about self-discovery, among other things. Now you have to sort of plumb the depths of yourself, which is why one of the requirements for confession is examination of conscience. And when you think about it, the idea of examining your conscience, how do you do that in a culture where the very notion of conscience doesn't even exist, right? You have to invent it out of whole cloth. You do so by positing the fact that there's not one self, but there's two selves, and the two selves are divided. One self commits the act, the other self that examines and interrogates and remembers these acts that are committed. So here you see the emergence of a new kind of subject. And that's one of the things that interests me about colonialism, the way colonialism imposes new ontologies, new ideas about being, derived, of course, from the West. And one of these ideas of being is that we are not one, but we are at least two. And we are split. And the whole point of conversion is to unite and to heal that split and to present it as to the priest, who then provides a way of sort of healing that split, right? Through penance and the grace of God, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are all very novel, and it introduces for the first time the possibility of what Foucault would call the modern subject. It's through Christianity, it's through conversion that the idea of the modern subject, the subject who speaks, but who is also the subject of his own speech, confessional, right, enters into the Philippines. So, a lot of people say, well, the modern period doesn't start until the Americans come. This is not true. The modernity really begins in the 16th century with the introduction of something like confession and the introduction of a new sense of a split subject. Now, of course, the other problem, as I've been trying to emphasize, is the fact that did it work? Did this idea of the modern subject work? And evidence shows that very clearly. It was very uneven, right? It worked for certain people, it didn't for others. The people who grasped at it, who went with it, who understood it, who exploited and expropriated it, eventually became very close to the centers of power, to the friars and so forth and so on. And to make a long story short, they eventually were to become the first nationalists. These would be the Rizals, this would be the Lunas, and so forth, who would then seek to overthrow friar power by seeking to take for themselves that power of the friar. And what was the power of the friar? It was the power of mediation. It was the magical power to be able to transport people from one realm to another and to posit another sort of world in which something like redemption could possibly exist. Right? These were the people who realized, as it were, the challenges and the promise of modernity, and they would constitute the Filipino elite.
Okay, Jean has something, but before I turn over the floor to her, you mentioned the word obedience, and most of the story of obedience is always just partial allegiance, or there's a mismatch between the intention and how people, I got this from you, but how people do what they want, what they will with the rules that are imposed on them isn't always as intended. Is that at work here as well in confession?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because even among priests, right, the idea of obedience, that's the unqualified obedience is expected, right? But the point is that it's never unqualified because obedience is always going to be partial. It's always going to be problematic. That's why you need confession, right? Because confession is the sign that obedience doesn't always work, that people always fall back into a state of gracelessness, so to speak. Therefore, in need, once again, of confession. So confession is a good deal because it's never ending, right? Until you die. It's only when you die that you stop confessing. And this is the last thing you do when you're on your deathbed. You confess, right? So yeah.
Okay, Jean, and after Jean we have Noel. So Jean, you first.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what you said about the creation of this new type of subjectivity. And this double subject, or this doubling of the subjectivity, I was wondering if this was connected to the category of the uncanny that you mentioned. And I also wanted to ask if you could say a bit more about this category of the colonial Christian uncanny. Is there something specifically different about this type of the uncanny, or it's something that I'm curious about?
Yeah, no, because it starts with this. One of the arguments that I made in Contracting Colonialism years ago was the fact that one of the ways to understand colonial invasion and occupation and the violence that colonialism brought with it from the native perspective is to think about it as the experience of shock. It produced shock effects, right? And part of that shock is both physical, emotional shock, as well as cognitive shock. right? There's enormous amounts of cognitive displacement, I assume, that happened whenever whenever colonization takes place, and you don't know what to make sense of it, right? And so you have a situation where, in place of shock, or as a response to that shock, there's a tendency to sort of seek protection and to seek safety and security. And one of the ways that happens, two ways it happens. One is you can resist, you can run away. And in fact, this was a very common response among Native peoples when confronted with Spanish demands and Spanish arms and Spanish violence, was to simply run away, move to the mountains, move to the forests or whatever, or you could negotiate. And one form of negotiation was conversion. Conversion was a way of seeking to account for the shock, for the disorientation of conquest by submitting, as it were, to the demands of the colonial rulers. And so the Christianity brought with it this sort of uncanny force, right? Uncanny in a sense that on the one hand, it was the familiar that at the same time seemed unfamiliar. The fact that Christianity spoke about, sort of potent mysteries, otherworldliness, and so forth, which of course was not something new in Native cultures. They had their own sense of mysteriousness, otherworldliness, and so forth. Different sources of potency. So what you get with Christianity is a whole new vocabulary. A whole new vocabulary for talking about power, right? Power that comes from a spiritual realm, right? Spiritual, transcendent, otherworldly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can imagine Native converts. I mean, Tomas Pinpin is a great example of this. If you read Tomas Pinpin's own libro, you get the sense of, well, if you are close enough to the friars, if you follow what they say, then you too can share in this new kind of power that they present. So the uncanny itself becomes a source of potency, becomes a source of power. And it then becomes, so the uncanny, rather than a source of terror, becomes an invitation, right? Becomes an invitation to access these new sources of power. And so you have in Christian colonialism, and it's always that conjunction of Christianity and colonialism. It's very important to remember it. So you have in that conjunction of Christian colonialism this sort of circulation of power, whereby it promises a certain kind of surplus of power to those who are close enough to the priests. And at the same time, it also creates a hierarchy between those who are sort of converts or close to the priests, and those who are farther away, who are not so close, who are not so savvy, and so forth. Yeah. So I mean, I could go on, but I'll stop there for now. So.
Noelle has her hand raised. Noelle?
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Vince, for that wonderful talk. I mean, after decades reading Contracting Colonialism and after 8 printings and all, we're still here talking about contracting colonialism. There have been private messages that have come in, and partly, well, 2 questions really. One is similar to what Father Tony asked earlier, which was, wasn't this the practice as well in other places in Europe? And was the response, I mean, what was the response of local people as well in these other places? And number 2, you talk about texts and the role of the word in confessions. Do you have examples of actual practices that were done, I mean, from the local people?
You mean practices of what?
Of local people in confession. I mean, the view. I think what she means here is, the local movement as well, the voice of the and the practices of what they did, because there's that other world as well. So you have two worlds coming together, right?
Yeah.
So you have the Spanish, the friar, but you also have the local populace coming to the confessional box. But how can we represent them? I mean, we don't have the actual words that came out. So how can we say and think what they actually did?
I think this is always one of the, as you know, Noel, from doing your own research, one of the problems of doing research in the 16th and 17th, 18th century is it's very difficult to hear, as it were, the voice of the natives, right? Mm-hmm. It's so highly mediated. So you have to go to the Spanish sources, particularly the missionary sources. And missionaries were extremely astute observers of native life, right? I mean, you read missionary accounts. Sure, they're biased, they're ethnocentric, they're racist, etc. But they're very, very good at getting the details of what exactly people are doing. I mean, this is why to this day we always go to missionary sources whenever we want to reconstruct the texture and the tone of native life. And I think one of the most neglected missionary sources are precisely the confessionals and the sermons, right? I mean, a number of people have worked on this, of course, not just me, but if you look at both the sermones, the Blancas de San Jose stuff, and then the confessional manuals, you'll see reflected in them precisely those intimate native practices, right? Mm-hmm. Everything from do you still go to your babailanes? What kinds of dreams do you have? Some of these confessions go on and on about what kind of dreams do you have, and what do you do with these dreams, right? I mean, missionaries were incredible anthropologists in that sense, right? And so when Totanes, Fray Sebastian Totanes says, how many times did you masturbate? People are talking about masturbation, and he's seen them. Or how many times did you do anything with animals? Right? I mean, you know that people are doing, bestiality, and he's probably seen them too. And of course, adultery and all of these things. These things were probably pretty widespread. And I think the missionaries were, of course, scandalized and worried about this, and so they would bring it up in the confession. And so forth. Did native peoples actually do this? I have no doubt that what's spoken about in the confession, in the confessional manuals, was a reflection of what was actually going on a daily basis. These were not constructions that were made out. These were not things that missionaries just imagined. I mean, I think they were very much based on what they witnessed or what they heard.
But isn't the confessional, the list of questions which you read out, isn't that something like the sermones, something that is a standard that is given from one missionary to the next?
Yeah.
So the list of questions. But are those list of questions the same for those used in the Philippines as in other parts of the world?
I mean, I think there's lots of similarities. And I think it has to do with the Christian, and this really starts in the 2nd century, right? The Christian, sort of emergent Christian obsession with the body and with sexuality, and there's an attempt to regulate sexuality and sexual practices across the globe. So these are the things that missionaries are looking out for. Now it's sort of to say that, well, therefore, missionaries are just making these things up. Yeah, perhaps to a certain extent they were, but to say that they weren't actually happening in native society, I don't think that's right either. I mean, I think that these things were actually going on, but natives understood them differently. Missionaries understood them in another way, and that the confession was a way of again, I use that term, trying to govern the conduct and the behavior of Native peoples. So, for example, it's very interesting. If you take the example of tattooing, right? Tattooing is pretty widespread. Many other things, teeth filing, lots of other stuff that were described in great detail in early missionary accounts. I mean, within a generation, they disappeared. I mean, as William Henry Scott noted, within a generation, they disappeared. And you can see the pressure, the effect of missionary presence in altering the very bodily behavior and bodily perceptions of Native peoples, right? And I think the confessional manuals are sort of a way of tracking how these things would change. So.
And just like that, an hour has gone by. Well, we are at 4 o'clock. But before we let you go, I don't know how you'll take this, Vince. I'll ask for a parting shot inspired by some questions that I received from the chat. The questions, and you take this whatever direction you want, is there, because you as a historian, you always find a way to make what you know of the past inform our thinking about the present. And so is there a way to connect the practice of confession to anything you want to choose in the present, whether it's race relations, whether it's the quincentennial, whether it's the Duterte government? The people who were talking to me were saying they're just thinking out loud, but they're very curious to see how our knowledge of practice of confession as we today informs us of the present. It's like gossip. The priest sounded like Gossip Girl to me. So in a way, you're shot for us.
Yeah, no, one of the things I talk about is, Duterte has this incredible story of being abused by the Jesuit priest, right, in Davao. Father Falvi, I think was his name. And he has many versions of the story. And one of the things I did was to gather together the different versions and to compose them. And one of the things that happens is that the abuse, the site of the abuse, as he claims it now, it's a question of whether or not it actually happened is another thing. But let's say for the sake of argument, it actually happened, that he was actually abused. He was 14 when it happened, and the site of abuse was the confessional. Right? He talks about how in Ateneo, every Friday, they went to confession and the priest would fondle their genitals as he heard their confession. And I mean, some of you are familiar with the story, but it's the same thing. It's just that the priest would keep them in the confessional box and urge them to tell more sins, because the more sins they talked about, the longer they stayed in the confessional box and the more the priest could abuse them. And so Duterte talks about how he had to make up all these different stories, including that infamous story of him, fingering his maid. Remember, he says, I committed this sin. I went and fingered my maid. And then later on, he says, no, I just made that up. I just made that up because the priest wanted more and more sins for me to make up. And what could a 14-year-old boy say? So I made up all these sins and so forth and so on. But here you see the way in which telling this story allowed Duterte to do two things. One was to foreground the sort of clerical power, right? The clerical power that he suffered under, a clerical power that demanded from him this kind of absolute submission, this kind of absolute obedience. That's one thing. And on the other hand, when he tells the story, he's able to tell it not so much as from the perspective of a victim. He doesn't say, well, I was victimized. He says, this is what they did to me. And by saying that, he's able to turn the tables around the priest, to expose the priest, to make visible what was supposed to be secret and invisible, and to do so, and therefore gaining an upper hand. Sort of being able to gain a different perspective from which to tell the story, and in that sense, offering a kind of, if you will, a kind of resistance to the priest, not by calling the priest to account, but by, in some ways, turning it into this sort of humorous story that makes people laugh, right? And by doing so, by deflating the authority of the priest that he had so long been carrying with him. So in that sense, you see how Duterte deal, and again, if the story is true, and again, for the sake of argument, let's say it's true, you see how Duterte deals with his childhood trauma of being subjected to the power of the father, as it were, by as being in a position to turn things around and in his own political acts exercise that power to terrorize himself. Right, he becomes the terrorist, and in that sense, succeeds in overcoming the initial terror that he had felt in the confession. So that's one way in which you can sort of connect the 16th, 17th century to the 21st. Right. So there is an element of authoritarianism that is woven into the pastoral power that is encoded in confession.
Ooh, wonderful start to part 3 of this conference. Jean, back to you.
Yes, I mean it's just a wonderful conversation, and just when we're ending, it gets really interesting. But this discussion about spiritual politics, it's I think a topic that we can have a whole new set of conferences on. I hope you will stay, Vince, for the rest of the panel this afternoon. So having said that, let me now shift to the panel 10 of our afternoon's conference. So once again, thank you, Dr. Vicente Rafael, for your keynote speech and for the wonderful discussion afterwards. We now proceed to the next part of our program, a panel on negotiations of institutions from the Middle Ages onward. Let me begin by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Jovino de Guzman Miroy. Jovi Miroy teaches philosophy of religion and medieval philosophy at the Ateneo de Manila University. He acquired his PhD from the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium. His recent publications are Discontinuity and Continuity of Devotion, The Virgin of Guadalupe from Mexico to Makati, 2018. Neo-Gothic Imaginary of Manila, San Sebastian Church, and Revising the City for the Global Age, published in Espacio Journal of Philippine Architecture and Allied Arts in 2019. And Ang Awit Bilang Remix, Katutubo, Wika at Filosofia, published in Unitas in November 2020. He directed in 2019 and produced Ang Apologia ni Socrates at the Arete here in Ateneo. And in 2021, he wrote a play on Marcelo H. del Pilar, Plaridel, with OICIA UP Diliman. He is anchor at Radyo Katipunan. Let me now give the floor to Dr. Jovi Miroy, who will deliver his paper entitled Recontextualizing the Spanish Colonial Philippines Within the History of the Spanish Middle Ages. Jovi, the floor is yours.
Jovi, we can't hear your audio.
I will unmute first.
Okay.
Is that it? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a recording, so. More than 2 decades of doing medieval studies by Filipinos in decades, whether the medieval.
The audio is a bit low and we can't hear it, masyado.
Especially our political studies. On the other hand, the medieval is better understood.
Can you check your volume?
Why would anyone want to dedicate their life to studying?
Jovi,
yes.
you have to start it from the beginning, and the audio, we can't hear you.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we can hear your voice, but not the recording.
So, would you rather? Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Would you rather that you play it?
Okay, I'll play it.
All right. Yeah.
I'm playing it now. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
What have I learned after more than 2 decades of doing medieval studies? Medieval studies by Filipinos interrogates whether the medieval should be overcome question which will be achieved when one defines what is medieval in our institutions and culture, especially our political culture. On the other hand, the medieval is better understood when one examines it in relation to modernism, postmodernism, and post-colonialism. Why would anyone want to dedicate their life to studying in the Middle Ages? Certainly not to return to the Middle Ages when there was no indoor plumbing or central heating, or in our case, central air conditioning. Why we study the past involves describing how the past reframes the present and vice versa. Historians reflect the present all the time. Furthermore, how we study a particular period in world history requires thinking how it will be done in the Philippine context. But what does medieval mean anyway? The question is not as easy as it sounds. For the word medieval has different associations. It usually refers to the period in Europe between the 5th and the 15th centuries. But we can also speak of medieval Islam, medieval China, and Japan. Medievalists would emphasize medieval Spain, as it differs from medieval Germany. Medieval can also be associated with feudal and Gothic. It's also understood as that which was superseded with the Renaissance by modernity. For a while now, scholars have shown the various rebirths during the Middle Ages and have pointed out the continuity between the medieval, Renaissance, and early modernity. Even more difficult to define is medievalism, or that which is a trace or an element that originated or belonging to the Middle Ages. Our presentation, however, aims to provide prima facie evidence that knowledge of Iberian Middle Ages can lead to improved understanding of the Philippines, especially Spanish colonial period. In this preliminary study, we wanted to know which period the Iberian Middle Ages could have had a direct relationship with the Philippines. We wanted to analyze objects and spaces in the material and visual culture to highlight the medievalisms in Philippine culture and history using the tools of intellectual history, history of art and cultures, and history of religions. We wanted to address the medieval Renaissance studies community and scholars and anyone else interested in this area of study. We did not, however, wish to correct misconceptions about the Middle Ages. First comedian Fran Lebovitz said, "People need their myths." Which dates are we considering in our study? 14th century, when the Kingdom of Castile was consolidated. Around this time, Muslim traders began to arrive in what is later known as the Philippines. Some sources, however, say this process can be dated back as early as the 13th century. The end of the 14th century was the start of the period of conversion of the Jews. Muslim missionaries started spreading Islam in what is later known as the Philippines. 1491 was the fall of Granada, a few months before Columbus's expedition. 1492 was the expulsion of the Jews, only 30 years earlier than 1521. 1519 to 1556, Charles V, also known as Charles I or Carlos I, was the Holy Roman Emperor. This presentation asks which popular objects and spaces from the material and visual culture be considered as Spanish medievalisms, and therefore provide prima facie evidence that knowledge of the Middle Ages can lead to better understanding of our history. Before I go into my discussion, I'd like to state the main takeaway of this presentation. How can Filipinos do medieval studies today? Medieval studies here would not have to be done in the same way as they would in Europe or China or Japan. Or it is to be noted that the medieval studies itself needed to be heard in medieval studies. Medieval studies would be less about national myths and crusades. Medieval studies by Filipinos cannot simply be about whether the colonial culture that the Spaniards brought here was medieval, or whether the Americans justified the colonization of the Philippines by the benevolent desire to liberate the Philippines out of the darkness of the continent. Medieval studies, therefore, must articulate the subaltern voices and not just the dominant ones. Despite 500 years of Catholicism and more than 500 years of Islam in the Philippines, the Filipino voice is still subaltern in medieval studies. Medieval studies in the Philippines can be more about action, praxis towards inclusion, diversity, and equality. On to our discussion. I will mention objects which are well known, and then argue how it can be traced back to medieval times. First is the image of Santiago Matamoros, the most famous of which is found in Port Santiago. This image can be traced back to Reconquista, or the period taking back the Visigothic and Christian Spain from the Muslim conquerors. The Muslims occupied most of Iberia starting from the 8th century. Reconquista started soon after that and was practically accomplished by the 13th century. But scholars have also shown how this image can also be associated with conquista, that is, trade and colonization of Latin America and the Philippines. Furthermore, we associate Santiago with going on pilgrimage to Compostela, a practice which began in the 9th century. And both suggestions that the myth of Santiago Matamoros and the mythical battle of Clavijo serve to obscure the defeat of Magellan and the figure of Lapu-Lapu, as well as to erase the figure of Enrique de Moluccas. Words used in the 11th century, Moro was used to refer to Muslims in Iberia. Today, Moro is used to refer to Muslims in the Philippines. We need to ask what is the continuity of the idea of the Moro in our culture. The arabesque, or what is called as atawrik, which we find in Islamic art in the Philippines and in our own Christian structures. The atawrik, or the repeating, instead may lead us back to the idea of convivencia, or that period when Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived side by side in Iberia. This period ended in 1492, 30 years before the voyage of Magellan, when the Jews were expelled from Spain. But convivencia would also tell us that when speaking of Spanish colonization, we are referring to a Spain that is extra complex. We find an embedded Orientalism in Spanish culture. Mudihar, after all, refers to Muslims who stayed. One scholar suggested that some of the Muslims from Al-Andalus brought Islam to Southeast Asia. We also need to ask about Islamic and Jewish influence in Spanish culture. For example, the astrolabe, a navigational technology Muslims and Jews developed in the Middle Ages, aided and abetted Spanish adventures overseas. The whole story of Magellan would not even be possible without Muslims and Jews in Al-Andalus. The notion of Spanish, while overtly Christian, is multi-layered. It's also possible that Arabic was known both to early Spanish settlers and Muslims in the Philippines. Iberian medieval studies include inquiry into the relationship of the dominant Spanish culture, Castilian, with Islam and Judaism. As has been shown by Florentino Radau, it should also include discourse on white domination and racism towards people of color. For our part, aside from asking whether the Mudihar style reached us, we need to ask about the relationship of colonial Spain with the Chinese, who, like the Mudihars, built the churches. We also need to ask about the relationship of colonial Spain with Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims in the Philippines. Is Intramuros medieval, or Renaissance, or Baroque? Fortified cities, however, were built in Iberia since the time of the Muslims. I am connecting this space to feudalism. The walled and fortified city can lead us to inquire about the ideas of protection and loyalty, lordship, and vassalage. The word feudal comes from the Latin feudum, meaning fief. While the term arose only in the 17th century, the system was clearly formed in the 8th century Frankish society. A system was the land of obligations of vassals to the Lord. We can better understand the power relations between datus, rajas, and sultans and the early colonizers if we set it within the feudal relations that marked social structures at that time. As we know, in the Philippines, the church was considered both a fortress and a sanctuary. Here we see that plazas are found in medieval villages in Spain and elsewhere in Europe. We can chronicle the evolution of the plaza in the Philippines and other parts of Asia. The walled city can also make us ask about hierarchy. Here we see the Posteo Gate, whose use was to serve the lords of the city. The systematic discussion of lordship and feudalism in political philosophy classes help us understand the political culture better? I should think so. Consequently, Intramuros as space could also make us ask questions about patriarchy and women, both in medieval Iberia and Spanish colonial Philippines. Next image is that San Vicente Ferrer. If you notice, Filipinos have a great devotion to San Vicente, judging from this ginormous statue the Pangasineses erected of him recently. I'm connecting this image with prior rule and influence and institution of conversion. Conversos are Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity, usually through brutal methods devised by St. Vincent himself. Prior influence we find in the figure of Andres Urdaneta of the Augustinian order. The Dominicans too belong to the wider Augustinian family. San Vicente Ferrer is a good example of medievalism hidden in plain sight. We wonder if any of us would associate him with the inhumanity of the conversion of the Jews, which would lead to the Spanish Inquisition of 1478 and their eventual expulsion in 1492, 30 years before Magellan's voyage. Bearing in mind the saga of the Conversos, how then should we reflect on the conversion of saints? What questions should we ask in writing the history of conversion and baptism in the Philippines? Then the cross. Here's the so-called cross of Magellan. Compare its starkness to the opulence of the treasures of Guarazar, which are closely linked to the myth of the Spanish identity. The treasures of Guarazar embody the Visigothic roots of Spain. Scholars have pointed out how the cross is emblematic of Spanish Catholicism and of the colonial apparatus. According to the construction of Spanish national myth, the cross and the crown cannot be separated. We, however, understood the cross in relation to the sword. The difference begs us to ask where the idea of the cross and the sword came from. Finally, we consider the image of Santo Niño of Cebu, which is done in the style of the infant of Mechelen. How did Flanders get into the picture? In 1519, Charles V became head of the Holy Roman Empire, which included Flanders. Here we see the double-headed eagle, one of the symbols of the Holy Roman Empire. We wonder if we understand the meanings and implications of the symbols attached to the cult of Santo Niño of Cebu. But perhaps Santo Niño of Cebu is less medieval than Renaissance. We have, however, this other image of the Santo Niño de Pasión of Makati. If you compare their hands and head, the image of Makati, the image in Makati bears an uncanny resemblance to the Santo Niño de Atocha. The cult of the image of the Holy Child is a favorite meditation point for classes in philosophy of religion. Why we are attracted to the image of the Holy Child is a question we need to answer adequately. The importance of the Nativity and Incarnation in Iberian Catholicism might be relevant. There's also the idea of pananampalataya or faith, or fe, as childlike dependence, which aided and abetted colonialism. The Holy Child, however, remains a powerful symbol of pag-asa, esperanza, or hope and agency. For who can stop us from seeing this child as a creative, playful power mentioned by Nietzsche, or the beginner's mind of Buddhism? In his History of the Jews, Simon Schama noted that 500 years after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, Auschwitz happened. 500 years later, as in the days of the Inquisition, even converted Jews were not safe from execution. The question the Filipino student of medieval studies should ask is, have we overcome the medieval? Should we and could we overcome the medieval? To answer this question, a subaltern voice of Filipinos must be articulated and heard in medieval studies. 500 years after the conquest of what was later called the Philippines, are we Filipinos seeing the superseding of the medieval or the opposite? Students of the Middle Ages or not, more than ever, we need to ask, are we articulating the voice of the overlord or the subaltern? Are we repeating or superseding reconquest and conquest? Are we excluding or including the Muslims and the indigenous peoples? Are we becoming more hierarchical or egalitarian? Are we becoming more feudal or democratic? Thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
That was the presentation of Jovi Miroy. And of course, during the Q&A, he will be answering your questions. Feel free to type in the chat box when you can. So I will go back to sharing my PowerPoint presentation. Just give me a second. We're going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker, sharing my screen, is John Noel Sanchez. He's in Strasbourg at the moment, but he's from the University of Toulouse. And his presentation will be on theological reflection and negotiation towards the question of slavery, an analysis on an unpublished collection of Jesuit moral cases written in the Philippines during the first half of the 17th century. Let me introduce our speaker. John Noel Sanchez Pons is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Foreign Languages and Cultures of the University of Toulouse in France. He is a specialist in the history of the Philippines during the 16th and 17th centuries, and his research focuses on the following issues: geopolitics of the Spanish presence in Asia, the dialectic between center and periphery in the context of the Spanish colonial system, Jesuit missions, Spanish involvement in the Moluccas and in the southern Philippine Muslim regions, and political and cultural negotiating processes between Spaniards and natives during the colonial period. I now give the floor to you, Jean Noel. You may share your screen.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my talk will be about reflection and negotiation towards the question of slavery, an analysis of an unpublished collection of Jesuit moral cases written in the Philippines during the first half of 17th century. So the legal development of the question of slavery in the Philippines entails a deep paradox, because on the one hand, prohibition of native Indian slavery was solved quickly. If we see the chronology, in 1570, the Augustinian Diego de Herrera complained about the practices of enslavement of the Spaniards. In 1572, we've got a very strange and uncanny decree asking the governor of the Philippines to give information about the slaves present in the archipelago in order to see if those slaves couldn't be sent to Mexico in order to work in the mines. But 1 year later, Lavezares, the new governor of the Philippines, sent a report giving information about all the kinds of slavery in the Philippines. And in 1574, the Madrid sent instructions to the new governor, Francisco de Sande, in order to ask him not to allow a new enslavement on the part of the Spaniards. Next step, 1581, Bishop Salazar insisted on the fact that Spaniards couldn't enslave native Indios. And finally, in 1589, there is an official confirmation of freedom of the indigenous people of the Philippines on the part of the crown. So apparently, the question is solved very quickly. And yet, there is the 1679 decree, which is that after Mexico and Chile, Madrid sent a decree to the Philippines to stop all forms of slavery, even for indigenous people taken in just war, in legitimate war, which provoked, a panic, an authentic panic in Manila. That produced a first document in 1682, trying to justify the practice of enslavement in the Philippines, which was followed by the second document about the same topic, explaining the reason why slavery was going on in the Philippines. And finally, in 1689, a confirmation from Manila that they will obey the order from Madrid, even if we don't know exactly what did they obey or not. So we've got 1 century between the two chronological markers, 1 century between 1589 and 1689. So why do we have 1 century between the moment when slavery is forbidden and the moment when Manila say, okay, we will do it? So the reason why is because the situation is blurred due to a set of specific parameters. The first one is the presence in the Philippines of slaves sold by the Portuguese, slaves available on the Manila market, which are Asian slaves, and which makes the situation a little bit confused about who is allowed to be a slave and who is not. The second parameter is the parameter of the war and the so-called Indios de Guerra, the warlike Indians. That is to say, the people, for example, the Muslim from the south of the Philippines, but also the Zambales or the Negritos, ethnic groups that oppose actively the Spaniards and bring them war. And in this case, enslavement can be considered as legal as it is a just war. The third parameter are the local indigenous slavery practices and the impossibility to forbid it because the King of Spain is supposed to defend indigenous rights and possessions. But the question is, what happened in between? We have a few clues about what is happening between 1589 and 1689. For example, regarding the question of the Portuguese slaves, we've got a memorandum of the Procurador General Hernando de los Rios Coronel, which writes to the crown in order to ask to forbid the market of the Portuguese slaves in Manila. Regarding warlike Indians, we've got another request from Hernando de los Rios Coronel, which is the official representative of Manila in Madrid, in order to allow the enslavement of Muslim Indians in 1607, and the positive answer from the crown in 1620. Regarding native customs of slavery, we've got plenty of documents. We've got several documents, in particular, the commentaries of Antonio de Morga in his famous Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, 1609, and many scattered anecdotes. But those anecdotes don't allow us to have a concrete view of the year-to-year trends. So the question is, wasn't there any discussion towards slavery in the meanwhile? So in order to answer this question, first, we have to make a little pause in order to understand the different levels of legality. First level, the level of positive civil right are the laws emitted from Spain. Second level still level of positive right are the prescription decided locally by the audiencia or the Manila Cabildo as an interpretation of those laws. Third, the positive civil right that are the native customs. Another level is the iure gentium, the level of interactions between people submitted to different laws that must be respected as such, as they are as legitimate as one's own laws. After, there is the level of religious rights, we can say. First, the natural right, that is to say, the eternal laws to which all men are submitted, based on theological or philosophical authority. After, we've got the proper religious right, that is to say, the church doctrine, the papal bulls. And finally, another kind of religious right are the decisions taken by religious order in the Philippines. We already saw that the religious orders were decisive in the evolution of civil law. So let's see further. We want to analyze quickly a document which is an unpublished compilation of moral cases conserved at the Jesuit archives of Barcelona. These are documents presented, the documents I will present were redacted by Juan de Ribera, a Jesuit, in the 16th, in the following years of the beginning of the 17th century, and by Diego de Bobadilla in the 1620s. The structure is very simple. There is a question and an answer. And as we will see, all the specific parameters we mentioned are discussed. For example, regarding the Portuguese slaves, we've got one item, which is from Malucas, arose this case about slaveries of Negapatam. So the case is that slaves bought in Negapatam, the Bishop of Malacca examined their paper and decided that they could buy back their freedom. So the question is, the masters will be obliged to free them if they pay? First question. Second question, the masters will be obliged to remind them they have got this right? The answer is very complex, but it is a good occasion for the Spanish Jesuit to say that the Portuguese Bishop of Malacca was wrong. More interesting and more developed in those texts, the question of Moros and other warlike Indians. So the question is if it is legal to enslave Indians taken in fair war. So as we can see, as we can see in the answer, we've got reference to concrete events, in this case, the attacks from Moros that happened in 1603. We've got the reference to debates between religious orders, that is that religious orders decided they joined together, they decided that it was legal to send the Moros to the galleys, but they were not sure if that was legal to enslave them. And the conclusion is that there is a need to wait for a royal order. So we can see different levels of justification. Another item about Moros and other warlike Indians, it's a meeting of the audiencia, the Cabildo of Manila and the religious representatives in 1606. The questions are, is it legal to wage war against Mindanaos? The answer is yes. Is it legal to wage war and punish Zambales? The answer is yes. Is it legal to enslave the first ones and the second ones? The answer is yes, because, and there is a series of arguments. The first one is Muslim raids are a danger for the Visayan Islands. And the second one is very interesting, because it says native allies have the right to own slaves, and between them, slavery is not as rigorous as among the Spaniards, which shows that this document has got a fair view of the trends of slavery comparing Spaniards and native ethnies. Native slavery is, of course, a big topic in those texts. For example, here, the question is, in the slavery, if the slavery practice of those Indians, the Spanish rule of partus sequitur ventrem, that is to say, to be a slave if the mother is a slave, must be followed. And the answer in the argumentation is that the Spanish practice of partus sequitur ventrum is not natural right, but iure gentium, that is to say, an arbitrary law inherited from Romans. Then indigenous practices are iure gentium also, and must be respected as such. Another question, which is quite disturbing for the missionaries, is the question of parts of slavery. For example, here, in some places, the Indians used to sell themselves. The question is if an Indian can sell himself by saying, one slave is worth 20 pesos, give me 10 and I will be your half slave, or 5 and I will give you 1/4 of my work, and so on. This is about custom, which is being sold. Second example, the question is if the Indians who are half slaves and half free can be totally freed by paying to their owner what they cost, despite the opposition of their master. So we can see all the different cases are observed and object of discussion. This according to specific determination of native culture. For example, we've got a long chapter about the habits among Bisayan Islands, which is here, and another one about the customs among Tagalog people. About the Bisayan Islands, the text is trying to see all the possibilities about slavery. First possibility, partus sequitur ventrem, which we exposed before. Second, partus sequitur patrem, that is to say the slavery is inherited not from the mother, but from the father. Second one, partus sequitur deteriorem partem, that is to say the child will inherit the condition of the worth of his parents. Fourth possibility, the opposite, that is to say the child will inherit the best condition of his parents. Fifth possibility, children will be all free and all slave. Sixth possibility, children will be half of the children will be free and half of the children will be slaves. So we can see the missionaries consider all the possibilities regarding a concrete problem, a concrete, let's say, situation among the native culture. And finally, the question of Spaniards' possession of slaves. First question, can Spaniards own native slaves? The answer is no. Can Spaniards own native slaves freed from the Muslims, which is a specific case? The answer is no. And can Spaniards own Muslim slaves? The answer, after a long argumentation, is yes, as for the Muslim from North Africa, which is an interesting point because it shows that the situation in the Philippines is analyzed through a global vision of the situation among the entire Spanish Empire. So, as a matter of conclusion, we can say that the great interest of this document consists in, first, a unique document for the Philippines, it's the only one, and a very rare document, it's more than 1,300 pages for the 2 volumes, in the global context of Spanish territories. That is to say that even for Mexico or Peru, we've got very few documents like that. Another interest is the superposition of levels of legality, or better say, the articulation between legality and lawfulness. Third point, the inclusion of contemporaneous debates that we will not know if they were not present in those texts. Another point is that the exposition of present in those texts is the exposition of concrete practices, and particularly indigenous practices, exactly as Vicente Rafael said about the precision of missionaries. And the last point is that this document shows us the on-the-go negotiation with indigenous customs and the dialogue established with them. Last point, I think this kind of document has to be studied in parallel with other sources, such as native tongue dictionaries. pananglitan kumutanaw ta sa kapulong ng Binisaya nga sinagol sa Sugbuanong waray-waray nga gipagawa sa 1711 apan na gisugod og sulat sa mga Jesuita sa sugdanan sa siglo XVII. Makakita ta kung unsay bot ipasabot sa mga pulong nga gihimo gikan sa pulong ulipon kundili uripon. Pinagi nining kapulong nana makamatyak ta sa mga buhaton sa mga lumad nga lumulupyo sa mga pulo nga Bisaya. Ug sa samay gayon makauna-una ta kung unsay bililhon sa batasan sa mga natibo sa pananaw sa mga misyonarong Kastila ug alang sa ilang kaugalingon tumong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jean-Noel was supposed to deliver his paper entirely in Cebuano, and then he decided to deliver it in English. And I'm so glad you decided to end your presentation by still letting us hear a bit of what your presentation could have sounded like if you continued with your original plan. It's very exciting to see how there is a presenter from Strasbourg talking about the Spanish period, speaking in Visayan at a conference in the Philippines. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you very much, Jean-Noel. We'll have you for the Q&A later, but now my task is to introduce our next speaker. So, you know, we've already circumnavigated the globe, starting with Vince Rafael in Seattle, then Jovi Miroy in Manila, then to Europe in Strasbourg with Jean-Noel Sanchez, and now we go back to Asia in Hong Kong. Stuart McManus is our next speaker. He's an assistant professor of world history from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He is a classicist working on pre-modern culture from a global and multi-ethnic perspective. He received his PhD in history. Secondary field is classical philology from Harvard and is currently assistant professor of pre-modern world history in Hong Kong. And prior to that, he taught Mexican and ancient Mediterranean history at the University of Chicago, where he was the inaugural postdoctoral fellow at the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge. During the 2019-2020 academic year, before the pandemic, he was a visiting scholar at Princeton's Davis Center for Historical Studies. Let me now call on Stuart McManus for his paper on the encounter of European and Asian forms of slavery and dependency, reassessing Juan de Paz's Consultas. You have the floor, Stuart.
So thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I unfortunately will not be able to regale you with my Visayan, but I'll do what I can. So, in 1687, a collection of moral cases by the Dominican friar Juan de Paz was published in Seville under the title Consultas y Resoluciones Varias Teológicas, Jurídicas, Regulares y Morales. Republished in 1745 and again in 1845, this collection was the fruit of Paz's years as a missionary in Cagayan, advisor to the Bishop of Cebu, and as rector and chancellor of the University of Santo Tomas and prior of the Dominican convent in Manila. Indeed, Paz was a well-regarded teacher and scholar, with particular strengths in theology, law, and philosophy in the Dominican mold, who was regularly called upon by the Archbishop of Manila to resolve tricky theological problems. His work as a theological expert also found its way into other publications, including a Latin collection of answers to problems sent by the missionaries in Tonkin, in modern Vietnam, a life of Santa Rosa de Lima, and it seems that there are other moral cases written by him, preserved in manuscript in the Dominican archives in Avila. At the same time, and perhaps more interestingly, he also made various enemies. And at the end of his life, he was called back to Rome to answer the accusation that he was a probabilist, although he died before he could reach the Eternal City. Now, as some of you might know, Paz's collection was treated in a cursory way in a 1972 article by Jose Arcia, but has since not attracted all that much attention. Today, therefore, I want to delve into Pass's moral cases with a particular focus on the history of slavery. This is an important topic since, like elsewhere in the Iberian world, the Philippines saw both the expansion of Mediterranean and Atlantic-style slavery, including the importation of African slaves, and interactions between European, indigenous, and Chinese conventions regarding slavery. Indeed, as the members of the School of Salamanca observed, slavery seems to have been a feature of all pre-modern societies. However, this is not to say that, quote, slavery was universal in the sense of being identical in each context. While there were degraded people who were considered alienable and akin to property in most places, the conventions regarding entering and leaving this status, their treatment, its hereditability, and so forth, all varied considerably, creating confusions and points of interaction between different varieties of pre-modern slavery. This is what happened in the Philippines, where local elites, Chinese merchants, and Spaniards of various origins, as well as people with mixed backgrounds, shaped the institution in different ways. The question of slavery and the interaction between different, so to speak, slave regimes appears throughout Pass's work. This includes both in the first section on contracts and restitution and in the second section on donations and testaments. Throughout, however, he takes the same and classic School of Salamanca approach, asking whether certain customs were in keeping with the three main categories of law. One, natural or divine law, which overlaps significantly with theology. Two, the law of nations, which you've just heard to refer to under its Latin name, Jus Gentium. That's to say the universally agreed conventions of mankind. And third, civil or positive law, written law like the Recopilación in the first instance, but also customs, both European and non-European. So bringing together all this required a lot of legwork on Pass's part and required him to apply his knowledge of Catholic theology, canon law, civil or Roman law, as well as having an ethnographic origin of local customs, both within the area he was in Manila and elsewhere, but also further away places like China. So let's turn to the text itself. Among the numerous consultas that deal with slavery, there are ones that deal largely with questions related to Spanish law and morality, which I will mention in passing just to give you some context to early modern Spanish ideas of slavery, because they differ in significant ways from, say, slavery in the US South, which might be more familiar to some of you. So this includes Consulta 34, which discusses the case of two native slaves from Cagayan who were married with the permission of their master. The husband was then pledged as security for a debt, at which point he ran away. The question then arose, after he'd been recaptured, as to whether the marriage was still binding, and so the couple were not allowed to be separated, especially considering that he had effectively abandoned the marriage when he'd fled his master. Similarly, Consulta 6 deals with the case of whether a slave should continue to serve a master after some doubt has arisen as to the legitimacy of their title. And if they do, and it turns out they're actually free, what compensation is to be paid to the formerly enslaved. There were also cases that ostensibly dealt with questions related to Spanish law, but which had potential implications for interactions between the Spanish and other slave regimes. An example of this is Consulta 42, which deals with the question of selling slaves who were married. Interestingly, a similar situation is treated in a manuscript of moral cases from the Dominican convent in Manila, now in the National Library of Mexico. In both of these, the question naturally arises of what to do with non-Christian slaves who were purchased already married from local elites or others. Were these non-Christian marriages to be recognized? And so the two slaves, in principle anyway, kept together. This was not always self-evident, as the extensive treatises written by missionaries on Chinese, Japanese, and other marriages in the period attest. Finally, before I close this initial section, it's worth mentioning that in Pass's treatise, there are also passing mentions of things you've already heard about, like just war slavery. Since the basic presumption in societies that grew up in the shadow of the Roman Empire, both Christian and Islamic, was that non-co-religionist combatants captured in legitimate wars were enslavable, since they were given the theoretical choice, your freedom or your life. This idea combined with the crusading mentality of Spanish indigenous Christians in the southern Philippines, where Muslim adversaries were considered enslavable. Okay, so turning now to clear examples of interactions between slave regimes. In Consulta 6 of Part 2, we find the case of Maria, a so-called India from Pangasinan, who writes a will without the help of a notary in her native language, and in the presence of witnesses, who, however, did not sign their names. Among other things, this will concerned a slave named Bernardo, who had 4 children, 3 male and 1 female, with a free woman. According to local customs, Pass tells us, if a non-slave and a slave had children, half of the children would follow the status of the mother, and the other half that of the father. However, for reasons of piety, Maria had decided that all 4 should be considered free. After her death, though, there was seemingly a request made by her heirs that this outcome be reviewed. Yet this clearly violated the civil law maxim of partus sequitur ventrum, the birth follows the womb, which you heard before, which mandated that status was defined by the mother, as well as the urgings of conscience, since the natural state of liberty was always to be preferred. Although admittedly, the ancient customs of Pangasinan were not against natural law, and there were many cédulas reales that required the respecting of local customs. This already rather murky and muddy situation was complicated by the fact that it was not necessarily clear that the testament was legally binding and represented the real intentions of Maria, since it was drawn up without a notary, and the witnesses did not sign their names, which they were required to do. Nonetheless, after several pages, Pass concludes that the will is indeed valid, and the 4 children are to be considered free. This he decides on the basis of an extended discussion of inheritance law, his belief that even poorly educated people like Maria accepted the principle of partus sequitur ventrum. This he combined with a concern that there were constant legal cases regarding the hereditability of slavery in the region, in particular regarding the issue of which particular children should be considered among the enslaved half. And these continual legal disputes had to come to an end. As a result, Pass decided that it was better to side with what he calls, quote, logic and conscience. Turning to another tricky case, in Consulta 40, Pass discusses the case of a navigator who had bought a Sanglé slave in perpetuity, in perpetua, in Macau. This had caused him problems when he arrived in Manila, since technically Chinese people were not allowed to be held as perpetual slaves, only according to so-called limited term servitude certificates, which was a document that stood somewhere between a title of slave ownership and a servant's contract. However, the sailor in question argued that according to Chinese laws, it was a legitimate sale, since the slave was in fact a Tartar or Manchu captured in war, presumably during one of the many battles that characterized the Ming conquest of China. Pass then debates the issue of whether contracts made according to the law of a place that you are just passing through, as was the case of this particular sailor, as opposed to permanently resident, were valid in other places, like the Philippines. In the end, he decided that they were, thereby avoiding excessive problems with what we might today call conflict of laws. Chinese slavery as it appeared in the Philippines was also the subject of Consulta 39, which treated the legitimacy of Chinese parents selling their children, with reference to the case of a merchant who had bought a 12-year-old Chinese boy for 8 taels of silver. This Chinese boy, a missionary then wanted to buy, convert him to Christianity, keeping him as a servant for a few years before he might set him free in order to undo this injustice. Asking the advice of Spaniards who had visited China, Pass learned that parents often sold their children due to poverty and high taxes levied on the common people. While understandable, Pass noted that this did not involve anything more than what he called financial difficulties, and so did not really represent what jurists called grave necessity, a prerequisite for sale by parents. This said, he argued, natural law did give parents the right to dispose of their children as they saw fit, and it was seemingly a long-standing custom in China for parents to sell children. So on the face of it, the sale was valid. Although if the missionary wanted to engage in an act of charity by buying and then freeing the boy, that was also to be encouraged. Interestingly, though, there is one injustice that Pass identified: the price of the slave. 8 taels for a child of 12 years in good health seemed too little to create perpetual slavery in his mind. In Manila, he said, slaves of 2 or 3 years cost 30 pesos, and a 12-year-old slave in good condition could cost up to 60 pesos, although he admitted that the value of money was greater in China, meaning that slaves were probably cheaper, without elaborating on what this might mean for morality. These are just a few examples of the phenomenon of interacting slaveries in the Philippines, although there are many more that I might have mentioned, including Consulta 77, which asks whether a friar should confiscate a, quote, Negrillo del Monte from a mestizo or Indio owner who claims that he had purchased him according to local customs. However, these will have to wait for another time. So in sum then, Juan de Paz's Consultas is an important text for our understanding of the intellectual and religious history of the early modern Philippines, including the history of slavery. In his treatment of the numerous, presumably real cases, or at least plausible ones, we see the many perceived overlaps and divergences between Spanish native and Chinese conventions regarding slavery from the perspective of one learned observer. This reminds us of the complicated and often troubling processes of negotiation that characterized the conquest and colonization of the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'd like to invite invite the tech team to put all our speakers together in the same screen, and we will proceed to our Q&A. Before we start with the Q&A, same reminders as usual. Please feel free to type in the chat box or to raise your hands so that I may call you. And we can also get questions from social media, from YouTube and from Facebook. We saw a round of applause. Thank you very much. Before we start, I'm wondering though, among the speakers, do you have reactions to one another's presentations? Let me start with Jovi. Jovi, when you were listening to their presentations, was there anything that stood out to you or struck you?
Oh, many things. Can you hear me? Of course,
Yes,
Stuart is a good friend, an old friend. I'm glad to meet you, Jean-Noel. My first question would be, could anyone own slaves? Did those documents specify who could own slaves?
It's for me, the question.
It's 17 hours.
The subtle point is that, as I said, those texts shows an interaction between levels of legality. So the very law is the law published and established from Madrid. After it is adapted in the Philippines, and especially regarding the question of native customs. Because the big problem, which is a very good excuse for Spaniards, is that anyway we cannot stop slavery because indigenous people got slaves, and according to the fact the king needs to protect the properties of the Indians, we cannot do anything. So, and after it's very easy for Spaniards to buy slaves, saying, oh no, it's not me, I just bought to an indigenous people. So that the answer from those texts is between normative and between advice, knowing that and that's the interesting point. It's not a space or black or white. It's a space of, okay, it should be like that, but the practice is like that. The use for the indigenous people is like that. The practice for the religious people is like that. So perhaps we could find a medium level of answer. And that's the interesting point, because as I said in my presentation, the point is that from 1589 to 1689, we've got a kind of big gap with documents that speaks about slaves, with some people like Rios Coronel that says, okay, we should do this or that, and the crown which answers sometimes, which sometimes doesn't answer, and people needs to do something with that. And this is the space of these documents. I mean, concrete problems and, as possible, concrete answers. I don't know if I answer your question. It's a blurred space. It's a blurred space.
But only Spanish subjects could own slaves.
Yeah. Theoretically, Spaniards cannot own slaves, indigenous slaves. But indigenous people can own slaves. So there is, of course, that's the problem. So there is a big space of ambiguity, knowing that, because I spoke about slaves sold by Portuguese. I mean, if the slave sold by a Portuguese is from Makassar or from Malacca, after 2 years, you will hardly make a difference with native Filipino. So there is a big ambiguity about this also, and the question of the Muslim Indians, the Moros, that can be taken in just war. Yes, but it's not sure. There is a 1620 directive from Madrid saying, okay, you can go, but it's not clear. It's not clear. And there is a quite known case reported by Tatiana Seijas of Governor Corcuera, who had a slave, which was supposed to be from Jolo, which was taken very, very, very young. And in one moment, he just wrote to the king saying, okay, I don't understand. Officially, indigenous people are free. How can it be I'm a slave? And he sued the governor. he sued the governor. And the governor said, no. First, he's from Jolo. Second, it's like a child. It's like my child. There is a space of strong ambiguity, which explains why they could go on until 1682. And even in 1682, they answered, okay, you have to consider the situation in the Philippines is very particular. So you cannot analyze the situation through the American example. It's very different. So.
Okay, Noelle has her hand raised, but before I call you, Noelle, you ended your line with an American example. So I'm gonna call someone from the Americas who wants to weigh in. Cuauhtemoc Villamar is based in Bangkok, but he has a question that is linked to Mexican experience. Cuau, you have the floor.
Hola, Cuauhtemoc.
Yeah, hi, right. Well, it's noticeable, it's outstanding, the fact that the one was the legal reality and the other one was the practices, the wide amount of practices sometimes in regional level related to slavery. And one of the things is a fact, historical, that in 1810, when the Padre Hidalgo is a Catholic father, initiate the independence of Mexico, one of the first decrees was precisely to abolish slavery. The same action, a few months later, by another father, that is Morelos, was established concretely in what can be called the first constitution of the independent Mexico. 300 years in which supposedly the slavery was forbidden in the New Spain, but the practice was there in different ways, in different levels. Also, forced labor that we may consider is not slavery, but in fact was for life domination of the bodies of others. This is one of the tragedies of the New Spain. And recent studies are showing that there was also a kind of slavery for deaths, similar to the one in the Philippines, in certain regions among indigenous people in the northern part of Mexico. So this is the other slavery that nobody saw until relatively recently, 10 or less, 10 years ago, there were new studies on that sense. So my suggestion, my comment, and my suggestion to myself is to study the documents with a pinch of salt in terms of what they are telling us, in terms of the discourse, the narrative of freedom, and what is the practice. And the information that you provide, both you, Stuart, and Jean-Noel, is really interesting because it shows how deep is this topic, this issue, in the reality of our society. Thank you.
Could I jump in and sort of ask, make a comment/question? So, yes. I mean, on this kind of question of de facto slavery or questions of definition, Dr. Sanchez, you mentioned that your source comments about the comparatively light nature of slavery in Asia, or sort of suggests, at least in passing, that there's a sort of qualitative difference of some sort. And I've seen this in sources as well. It's not very common, but from time to time, people will say, slavery in Asia is not like slavery in, I think they're thinking of African slavery in the Atlantic as kind of the archetype, but they kind of say something about slavery being light. And I'm wondering what you think of this.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, this is part of the argumentation of the 1684 document. So I recall in 1679, the Crown say, okay, stop it. So Manila answered first in 1682 in a document which is totally crazy, like a panic, with argumentation totally crazy. Like there is an argumentation that they say in this document, 1682, that anyway, we have to enslave indigenous people because if we do not, they will attack us. Which it is like to say all we have done in terms of colonization during 150 years doesn't exist. So after this document, they just certainly thought that the answer was not good enough. So they made another document, very clean, very organized, very rational. And in this document, one of the arguments regarding the just war, and regarding just war and the enslavement of Zambales and Negritos. One of the arguments is that anyway, with this practice, the Zambales and Negritos, they become slaves of the Pampangos, and the Pampangos are very kind with them, like fathers. They feed them, like family. So of course it will be difficult to stop with that, because those Pampangos that are absolutely necessary to the colony treat their slaves very well. And yeah, if I quoted it in the text I analyzed today, is that it's very interesting that they recognize. They recognize clearly that, okay, we are speaking about slavery, but there is slavery and slavery. And anyway, even if they don't say it, Spanish lay people all know that slavery doesn't mean the same for us and for them. And that's pretty interesting, because this is concretely the kind of interesting stuff you can find in this kind of document. That is to say, the background.
Do you think it's true, though? Do you think it's true? I honestly don't know. I ask myself.
I do think concretely, because most of the slavery, it depends on the zone. But if you go to Visayas with debt slavery, it was extremely common, debt for otang.
Yeah.
And it's a form of servitude, which is which gives the owner social importance, because a lot of people are serving him, but not technically in terms of exploiting the human force, I think. So I will say it's kind of true, but
okay.
Well.
Let me just even up the gender balance a bit and turn the floor to three women who are lined up to talk. Jean, can you call the women who have questions for our male panelists?
Feliz Noel, just to make sure we know which Noel I'm calling. Noel, can you
yes
yourself?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much to the panel. I mean, of course, starting with Vince Rafael's keynote, it flows in actually to this panel, and with Jovi Miroy giving like the medieval background. And actually, I'm looking into Blancas de San Jose's sermones. And there was a write-up by Father Mario Francisco, who also spoke a few days back on, and he has written on slavery. And here he looks at, and thank you to both Jean-Noel Sanchez and Stuart McManus to look into data, looking into cases that involve slavery as well. But in all these cases, of course, the material is from the is very legalistic, you know. It's and so that is the medieval point of view, I guess, in that sense. And with Blancas de San Jose's sermones, where he uses the language, this one is in Tagalog language, and he looks into and when he brings in Christianity, he starts to use, of course, the language of the people. And here he starts to use the word alipin. So I think what Vince Rafael earlier was talking about contracting, I mean, when he speaks about contracting colonialism, or when Father Rene Havellana did his keynote as well with the contact, of two. Here we have, in terms of slavery, two different worldviews coming together, right? And so what is of interest is to look into the local culture. So Jean-Noel, for example, you gave Mateo Sanchez vocabulario, and there words come up with regards to the Oripun. And so what is interesting, and maybe what I can I ask of you is, in your readings of all the cases on slavery, again, the local voice and the meeting, and maybe looking into, and therefore what type of Christianity would have emerged based on that concept of slavery coming in, because as we know, they're not equal. An alipin is not an esclavo, or an oripun is not even. But in Blancas de San Jose, I think by using the knowledge, he comes and sees it as well. So for example, he looks at the angels as alipin sa gigilid of God, right? So those things that come into the picture. So I just wanted to take note of that the meeting of these two worlds, and what happens in these encounters.
Yeah,
just,
I think this is our drama as historians. For example, the vocabulary is incredible, but of course they don't give the name or the social status of their native informer. So we have, through the Western documents, we have to chase the native informer and the native source, but we don't have it, at least for the 17th century. I mean, the closest to the native world is the kind of document I presented, except if we find something else, which we can hope. But yeah, it's a big frustration. It's
like the sermones, for example, because it's the language itself of the people. I mean, that is being used. So the word opens up so many worlds.
But the question of slavery is quite specific, because of course it's slow, it's hard argumentation. But in the Casos Morales, it's not the only topic. For example, there are a lot of cases about women's sexuality. And in this case, the examples are more day-to-day life. And in those cases, it's less the law and more the concrete example of practices of Juana that married a man and that cheated him. And so the same, you don't know who is Juana, because everybody is Juana. These are anonymous examples, but it's closer to the possible real life of the indigenous people. But well, yeah, it's very frustrating.
Thanks, Dr. Sanchez and Noel. Let me just read before I call on Ruth. So Ruth, you're up next. But before I call on Ruth, let me just read a short message typed in by Father De Castro. He wrote, "The word slavery obviously is a complex analogous term, but it is clearly the case that slavery in the Philippines was not chattel slavery, nor was it anything like the African slavery as found in the US, the British colonies, or Brazil." So thanks for that, Father Tony. Ruth, feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel, very interesting. Finally, I met Stuart. Hi, nice to meet you, Stuart. We talked a long time ago via email. Hello, Jean-Noel. I think we met once. So I have comments with questions. One point is, I'm not an expert in 16th and 17th century. My area is early 19th century. So but I use and I read a piece recently of Bryce Beamer about Bangkok Creole City, in which he highlights how slavery is romanticized in Southeast Asia in the studies, on the area studies, because supposedly there is no comparable to the chattel type of slavery that we encounter in Africa or in the Americas or in Europe. So my question is is it, and then he highlights the importance that to understand that even though it is maybe not as brutal as the one that we see in America, it has its amount of violence and brutality too, because it is in some ways it gets out or like kind of is the stress of dislocation, no? Of basically to be in a place and then they remove you from your group, from your family, from everything. Do you have encountered any of those documents? Expressions of that distress, like in a kind of way, like to give a kind of a counterbalance to this legalistic argumentation. And then the other part is it really does end, because afterwards, actually talking about Biana that I talked yesterday, Biana has a case in which he actually got himself put in arrest in his house because he in 1762, 61, he defended a poor man that he was a client of an important gobernadorcillo in Tondo, who basically the guy who could not have paid his debts to the gobernadorcillo, and the guy basically took the guy, put him in his house, and chained him to one of the places, one of the poles of the house, and then basically kept him there, and then forced him to serve him. And then also I found in 1820 an interesting document, and which is a Spanish that roams within the countryside, and still like kind of is completely paralyzed by the fact that men still have to go and then pay and work for free for the father-in-law. So I have encountered examples of still like in some ways this kind of like this forced labor in some ways. So does it end? Does not end? Is it mutates? Have you explored beyond the 17th century? Thank you very much.
As I said, the 1689 end of the story is just an answer from Manila saying, okay, we will do it. And effectively, if you look in Paris, the documents after this period, the beginning of century 18, with the keyword slavery, systematically slavery is the Dutch. But nothing's, bad Dutch. Nothing says that they stopped it. I mean, because you've got the 1684 document, which is an argumentation justifying that, no, you don't understand, it's not like that. And after the 1689 saying, okay, we will do it. We will do what? It's not clear. So I didn't find a document which could prove that it stopped, especially with Maslin from the South. I'm absolutely sure that Jolwan people were taken in a failed raid in the 18th century were enslaved, for sure. But regarding the question of the romanticism of Southeast Asian slavery, regarding the Philippines, I think I'm not wrong if I would say that my century is the 17th century. In the 17th century, the wars for the indigenous people is the forced labor, especially for the building of ships during the emergencies with the Dutch. That is to say, 1605 to 1620s, and that's the wars. And as a matter of fact, a lot of indigenous people, Pampangos, in order not to participate to this forced labor, were ready to enslave themselves.
That's exactly my question. is it lighter because there was a kind of consent on the side of the?
Yeah.
Then is that technically?
But I don't assume that it had to be all the cases. It's like in the cases of local, like someone that sell themselves, it was because it was within his own community. But what happens with all those that they're actually removed from the community and then brought to Manila?
There is a law. According to which I don't know the distance, but there is a limit in the distance where you can sell slaves. I mean, you cannot. I think it's 50 miles. Something like that.
And that is my yes. To a large extent, it is medieval, but I think I see a modernizing tendency in a sense that this kind of clarification through law is that where it is? It's this modernism that is the framework of all these laws.
Yeah. Anyway, if there is a law,
certainly an origin of sort of modern international law. These kind of questions of definition. I mean, to some extent, it feeds into the
even law
Declaration of Human
as a
Rights
kind of construct,
like
as a social construct.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's applied to an institution that we wouldn't endorse today, but the way of thinking is very much like the modern rules-based system, for sure.
If I can, if we think and speak about law, there is one very simple parameter that we have to think about, is that in most of cases, Madrid doesn't understand anything. For example, in the 1684 document, when the audience of Manila explains that we've got Muslims in the south, they are very aggressive, they attack us, they enslave our little Indians that are baptized, so it's absolutely fair to enslave them. And they speak about Moro. And so you've got the document, and you can see in the margin the comments from the functionary of the Consejo de Indias, that is to say, the commentaries from the functionary in Madrid. And in the commentaries, in front of this paragraph, the guy says, but why do they, what's the problem? They should not allow people from Levante, that is to say, Eastern Mediterranean. They think they are Turkish. They should not allow people from Levante to enter the Philippines. So the guy is reading the report, thinking that when they speak about Moro, they are speaking about Maghrebans or Turkish. So we have to replace this crude reality in order to understand what is law. I mean, this is a deaf dialogue. They don't speak the same language. And very often, people in Manila they know perfectly in Madrid, they don't understand anything. So they are playing with that. And that's the reason why it goes on.
Noel, would you like to say something? Feliz.
With regards to Ruth de Llobet's point, first, when we talk about, as I mentioned earlier, esclavo, of course, is not equal to alipin or oripun. But not only that, within oripun or within alipin, there are many different levels. So it is very difficult for, like in the text itself, looking at the cases, to understand the local or the indigenous practices based on that, because that is their the friar or the law, that is the other way of thinking. But in the indigenous way, they look at the master not as more as a creditor, because as most people have said, it's utang, right? But we have to look as well as the fact that for example, Cebuano Visayan culture was a raiding community. I mean, they would go and raid, and there would be examples, for example, of entire communities that were brought from another place to another place. So I think, Ruth, you were asking about that as well, right? So there were, and Alcina would point them out. Oh, you know, there's an entire community of Tagalogs that were raided and now live in this particular other place. You know, so Alcina has said that, and there are samples of that.
Do they do explain the distress, like kind of if these communities like did the friars in any moment express that distress? Like, for example, for the 19th century, there is sources for the case of Burmese and different groups that had been brought by the Chakra dynasty in the middle of Bangkok.
Yes.
So I don't know if there is any explanation. There is any the friars were basically saying anything about that part.
Yes.
Emotional part.
That one, yes. And of course, much later, if you look into Jim Warren's Sulu Zone, and that's all raiding, right? But that's a later period, but which can also reflect into how, and there he gives examples of lives of the slaves themselves and what they went through, and how there's manumission. There's also people who became, you know, the raiders themselves. So there's an entire different community there. But I think Jean Noel mentioned the Mateo Sanchez dictionary, which brings a lot of words that refer to that as well. So it's all there. And then you have all the sermones and all the documents that are in the language of the people themselves, which really bring up a lot of the local mindset, I think, and the local world.
Father De Castro, would you like to add something? Father Tony?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I will not show my video because this reduces my bandwidth. Okay, so please just be content with my voice. First of all, I guess several comments. I think what's important about the reports of Stuart and Jean Noel is that it sets the case that this problem did not go away. Okay? But the background for, of course, the whole question of slavery is in the Philippines, even with the Agustinians, as early as the Agustinians, De Rara, and of course the arrival of Domingo de Salazar. This was an I can hear. Okay. This was one of the reasons for the calling of the Synod of Manila to resolve cases connected precisely with slavery, okay, and the practice of slavery that the Spaniards, in fact, as well, took from what they understood to be slavery in the Philippines then, okay. So, and then of course, the wider context of this would be, as mentioned by Stuart, I think, or was it Jean Noel, the idea of Salamanca, or was it Jovi, Francisco de Vitoria, and of course Bartolome de las Casas, right? All of that, all in the 16th century, forms, you might say, the larger background for all of these controversies with regard to the rights of natives and the whole question of slavery. So, but I think precisely the significance of your talks is that it shows that this problem did not go away. It continued on, although perhaps part of the problem was how to really understand what kind of slavery was the problem, okay? So when I said, for example, in a comment earlier, that this was not as brutal as African slavery, And of course, in Latin America as well, the impulse for slavery was really the plantations and the mines. Okay? The Philippines had no huge plantations at this time in the 16th century, and there were no mines really of the same scale to speak of as we find them in Latin America. And therefore, the brutality of that slavery and also the idea that this slavery in the US, for example, was perpetual, okay? And the idea that families, members of the families, could be sold off to different masters, etc. So I think it's very important here, and I think Noel's point is that we have to understand what slavery means from the point of view of the native, and what was the native practice anyway, and much of it was in fact debt slavery. I pay my debt to you with my labor, and it's for a particular period of time. It was not perpetual, it was not inherited, supposedly, unless it has something to do with debt. Okay, so I think in many ways the confusion then with regard to the term slavery is something that needs to be addressed. What exactly are we talking about? No? And of course, the brutality of it is, as I think Ruth's question had to do with the slave raiding practices then operative in those times, and the displacement of people, etc. But I think what's certainly interesting, given the fact that these slave raiding practices were common in the Philippines, the fact that there was no open slave markets in the Philippines for that. So this idea of Portuguese slaving practices, Portuguese slaves sold in the markets of Manila, that I think would be a significant thing. No? That they were openly being sold, so for me that would be a question. What exactly, when you say market in Manila for slaves, what does that mean in the concrete?
Felice, you want to answer? I think you wanted to say something.
No, just to comment on Father that yes, there was actually slave, well, not a big slave market, but that for example, those that were caught, for example, in Mindanao, were also used as slaves in Manila. That's one, and but that's not my point. You know, but there was slavery. We didn't have plantations, so colonial type of slavery did not take place because we did not have those plantations. But just to bring back again Blancas de San Jose of the 17th century, when he wrote the Sermones, and he wrote it in Tagalog, and he says, and he equals God as a slave master. So he explains just to show you, there are many levels and different ways, and through time, the point of using and the word slavery is so complex. If you read this, God as a slave master, and there are two types of slaves: the bad slaves, who are the demonio, right, the evil ones. And these are the bad slaves, and there are the good ones, and the angeles are the alipin sa gigilid, for example. So I just wanted to bring that up, that it's very complex, and that there are many other sources that will enrich the sources that you have used, which is really very, very, very good. But that there is also the language. As I said earlier, the word opens up really so many worlds, the local world that is there. And that is what we want, the encounter, and what happens in this encounter, and what type of Christianity comes out of that. What type of, after a few generations, what takes place. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
I hate to cut this very animated discussion short. It's just that I noticed that some of us have to leave, and if that were not the case, I think we would happily go on for another hour. But just to end our discussion nicely, maybe just a few words of if our panelists have some parting words to share with us before we close our event. Would you like to start, Stuart?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think all of us have shown these different interactions that took place. Some of them we might look on more favorably. Some of which I think we rightly condemn, like the forced labor. There's an excellent article by Stephanie Mawson about this. But the only thing I'd like to add is that these kind of discussions we're having were actually had by contemporaries as well. So if you read the treatises of people in the School of Salamanca, they do kind of they do realize that they're really kind of that the normative framework they have is not quite mapping onto reality, and the way they get around it ultimately is it actually sounds almost modern. They talk about this concept of dominium, which I guess Foucault would have called power. Right, you have two types of dominium. You have the dominium of a sovereign, and you have the dominium of a slave master. And the kind of overlap between these two, I think you see. Are you someone's debt slave, or are you their slave? Are you a subject of a monarch who can send you to build a ship in horrible conditions, or are you his slave? I think you see these debates we're having here reflected in the sources as well.
Jean-Noel?
First of all, I would like to share my happiness to have been able to participate to this panel with Robino and Stuart, and to really to thank the organization. I think that the event is absolutely fantastic. It's important to be able to do things like that, to share opinions and researches with scholars from all around the world interested in the Philippines. And my last word will be in some way in the same direction that Vicente Rafael put his last words, that is to say, speaking about the contemporaneous trends of the Philippines, and perhaps about the President Duterte, and perhaps one good lesson about what we spoke about is the importance to see the difference between legality and lawfulness. You can make a law giving you the right to shoot people in the street. It doesn't make it lawful. And yeah, for me, that's the most important. If as historians, we can contribute to the everyday reality of fellow human beings.
Jovi?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a good presentation if it elicits a lot of questions and discussion. So all of this, it reminds me of The Tempest, of the disenfranchising of Caliban. And for my part, I think I will look into the concepts of slavery in the corridos. And of course, that famous Filipino word, utang na loob. So with that, we say thank you to all of you. And Jean, nice seeing you.
Thank you, Jovi. Thank you, Jean-Noel. And thank you, Stuart. I now pass the baton back to Nikki. You're muted, Nikki.
Thank you, Jean. I'm so sorry. I'm so excited to invite everybody to the next events. Tomorrow, we will have a panel discussion on government institutions, and the speakers are from Lisbon, from Madrid. We already have received their presentations. And Leah Castañeda Anastasio will be joining us from North Carolina. She's here now. Hi, Leah. This is why the time tomorrow is out of our usual. It's at 7 p.m. So we hope to see you all tomorrow at 7 p.m. And then on Friday, religious institutions, we have 2 panels back to back. Part 1 will have Elsa Pinalva and Kevin Carrera Suarez and Joaquin, Father Sumpaico, and then Father Manalastas and Father Tony, who also participated today, will be presenting on Friday. We go back to regular programming 4 p.m. on Friday. And on Saturday, we have From Spices to Startups, a special panel discussion organized by the Philippine Embassy in Portugal. It's on Philippine-Portuguese trade relations, and there will be themes like food, Mabuti Sardines, the Web Summit, and Philippine investments in Portugal and vice versa, Portuguese investments in the Philippines. Please do join us. That will be at 4 p.m. on Saturday. And finally, the last panel for this conference would be, for part 3 of the conference, would be a talk on the city. We will have 4 speakers, so we will have a 2-hour event next week on Tuesday from 4 p.m. So we hope to continue seeing all of you. Jean, to close up.
Well, it's been such a delight to be here this afternoon. I can't believe that almost 3 hours have passed. On behalf of the School of Humanities of Ateneo de Manila University and our partners, CHAM Centro de Humanidades, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and the National Quincentennial Committee, I thank all of you for joining us today. This has been Contacts and Continuities. Good evening or good morning, as the case might be wherever you are in the world. Thank you for being here. Bye.
Bye.